following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Leanna Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for practical advice for everyday problems using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This episode, it's back to my regular format. Just me and one guest, and it's a great one. Dr. Robert T. Muller, a psychology PhD at York University, is going to be here later talking trauma therapy. And I set this interview up weeks ago, and things just worked out because I saw Creed 3 over the weekend. Apparently a lot of people saw Creed 3. It's doing very, very well. And longtime listeners know I love the Rocky movies, and that includes the Creed movies in my mind. It ain't about how hard you hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward is one of my personal mantras, but not one of my top 10 phrases because that's a line from Rocky Balboa. But Creed 3 dealt directly with early life trauma coming back and hitting you just when things are going fairly well. And yeah, okay, it involved a lot of visual metaphors that bordered on kind of cheesy. And there were more than a few moments when Michael B. Jordan and Jonathan Majors were doing the boxing sequences when I thought Killmonger hit Kang right in the face. But I ended up really enjoying the movie. It dealt with a lot of things they don't tell you in therapy about trauma that I wish someone had told me about trauma. Then I realized I should do a show about the things I wish someone had told me about trauma instead of just muddling through it myself. So this is that show. If you want a question, leave a comment or make a suggestion. We've simplified the system. Just go to nottherapyshow.com. Everything It's Not Therapy is there or will be there in the coming weeks. Right now, you can join the mailing list, you can leave the comment, or you can buy tickets or click the link to buy the tickets for our workshop about how to stop beating yourself up April 29th online, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Tickets are only $10 and the first 50 are 2 for 1. Or you can follow me on Not Therapy Show on Twitter and Instagram. I've been neglecting that badly. I am trying to do better. Okay, so here goes. The things I wish someone had told me about trauma. If I'd known these things sooner, I would have made progress much faster and easier and had fewer false starts. So first thing, mental health official language makes it sound like the trauma is a weakness or a fault instead of a sign that your environment failed you. Trauma is your brain desperately trying to keep you safe so that the bad thing doesn't happen again. You can't just turn that instinct off. And yet all of the professional language surrounding the whole thing makes it sound like you can. Mental illness, a disease that needs to be cured, right? Disordered thinking means you're not making any sense. You're just chaos, right? When you think about it, the idea that everything was fine with your brain until something terrible happened, and now there's something deeply wrong with your brain, well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? PTS or PTSD is sometimes described as an emotional injury instead of a mental illness, and I'd add the concept of moral injury as well as an emotional injury. Bad things happen, all of us know that. But trauma is connected to something beyond bad. It's connected to something wrong happening. And we couldn't stop it. No one stopped it. And people are supposed to stop wrong things because they're wrong. People with trauma have to rebuild their relationship with the world, how it functions, and what we can reasonably expect from life. After the system of a person's life totally fails them, trauma can often make a person feel like a failure. And therapy makes that worse because therapy can be part of the system continuing to fail that person. I work with a lot of neurodivergent clients, and I find it an absolute blessing because a lot of the times the things I figure out work for them, They work for everyone, just most people need less. But some of them don't. One of these neurodivergent clients, specifically an autistic client, expressed a ton of frustration at the idea of moving on. That's a goal, not a process, he said to me. And he's right. The other term he objected to was new normal. And he was right about that too. When your life has been upended, there is no normal. Never mind a new normal. That's the problem. What do I expect? P.S. Normal isn't necessarily healthy. Think about the messages people get in therapy, okay? You need to move on. Oh, gee, thanks, person. I'm paying $200 an hour. Why do you think I'm here? I could have told myself that. I have told myself that. Go out and meet new people. So all the garbage can repeat itself in an unending cycle? What's the point? Use the tools. This isn't carpentry. This is my life. I don't know when therapists started thinking that referring to shifts in perspective as tools was a good thing. For me, it felt like they were seeing me as a broken toy that could be fixed instead of a human being who wanted to be understood and supported. A person who is traumatized has kicked their own internal butt every way they can think of, and it didn't make things better. By the time that person enters therapy, any imperative like, you have to let it go, is going to make them feel like a failure. Even when the advice is right, when it's delivered that way, it makes it seem like it should be easy. Just let it go, like the Disney song. Missing that there was a lot more movie after Elsa's big solo. Yeah, it got darker after that, didn't it? Yeah, just let it go. No, it's not that easy. My client was right that these are goals, not processes. And therapy is where you're supposed to learn the process. And the problem is often you don't. It's one thing to study trauma. It's another thing to experiencing it firsthand. Therapy is inherently artificial, so it's a piece of the puzzle. But the complete puzzle, the process, requires more than tools. It requires raw materials to work with that only the best therapists that are a good fit for a client can provide. And don't get me started on the good fit thing. Maybe after the interview, maybe another week. This is probably not the first "what I wish I learned about trauma" show. But I want to get to our guest fairly quick this week because I was really excited to talk to Robert Mueller. No, not the Robert Mueller in the news. Dr. Robert T. Mueller, psychology PhD, York University, with a different approach. And those of you listening in Ontario can access some of the stuff for free if you like what you hear. So stay tuned. If you're not in Ontario, you can, once again, I'm going to plug this to death to make sure everybody knows and hears and all that good stuff. Workshop, April 29th. Stop beating yourself up. Tickets are only $10. Nottherapyshow.com. Please join our mailing list so that you can stay informed. We're not going to send you very many once a month, once every other month for now. We're not going to spam you just when we have something to announce, but we'd love for you to be part of our community. And I'd love for you to stay with me after this break. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. I will be back talking alternative solutions and healing for trauma. Stay tuned. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm Leanna Kersner. I am not a therapist, and we are talking what they don't tell you about trauma. I've got a guest this week that is going to talk to you about trauma, who actually is a professional. Dr. Robert T. Mueller, author of Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up. And Rob's here to talk about specifically healing from trauma. I suggested this because it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Rob, thanks for joining us and thanks for being so open about the whole thing.
For sure. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Now, why did you decide to specifically focus on opening up?
Well, because so many clients really struggle with that actual process of building trust. It's really hard, especially when you've been through something that really makes you question exactly that, trusting other people. And if you've been betrayed, disappointed, abandoned, severely hurt emotionally by someone, the question is, how are you going to be able to move forward with your life? How are you going to be able to get back on track in terms of your development, in terms of your relationships? And in counseling, it is challenging to be able to feel like you can trust the person. First of all, they don't deserve your trust necessarily. They need to earn your trust when you're a client. And so when I work with my clients, I definitely am very aware of that I need to earn their trust. And so the process of opening up can be really challenging. And so, yeah, so that's what I wrote a book about.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, yeah, I mean, trust is inherently earned, isn't it? And that's a big part of the challenge of healing from trauma is it's a loop, right? You have to take little risks. Hopefully they work out. If they do, well, then you learn to trust again because people give you reason to trust. But our vocabulary as a culture is, in my opinion, and I'll confirm this with you, really bad. A lot of shoulds have to you need to learn to trust again. You need to take risks. You need to. Meanwhile, the amygdala in your brain is going, no, stay in the cave. You need to stay safe. And
Right.
that's why I think the opening up process is central. It's fundamental. So,
Yeah, and I think that's really a very good point that you make because you feel like your head may be telling you one thing, but your body's telling you something else. And so many people who have trauma struggle with depression and struggle with other emotions, anxiety, other things that kind of keep them away, and their body's telling them, no way, don't do this. Sometimes with a lot of folks that I work with, we don't necessarily jump into. In fact, I really generally recommend that people hold off on talking in any kind of detail about their traumatic events. A lot of what we do initially are exercises around about the physical aspect of trust. And so, for example, I get a lot of my clients, I suggest to them to begin with trauma-informed yoga, to begin with actually self-defense. Many people really find that's very, very helpful. A lot of folks I work with, I suggest to them to start doing art because then
mhm.
you're actually physically, like if it's painting, it's a physical act and it's often emotional, creative. Your body is sort of opening up to other kinds of things with self-defense, like with martial arts, let's say. If it's a good dojo where there's a certain amount of compassion and kindness and open-mindedness, that can be fantastic. Building confidence, building a sense of sort of owning your body and feeling comfortable in your own skin. Trauma-informed yoga, same sort of thing. So I really, yeah, I work with a lot of people around the physical aspect as well as before they even begin talking about stuff that happened that's uncomfortable to talk about.
Yeah, that's the part that around the time I was diagnosed in 2013, I could set my watch to a physical response, a physical stress panic, 11:03 at night, because that's when one of the major events happened. It was off by a minute or two sometimes, but light clock, I wasn't thinking about it. I'd feel it in the body. And on TV, the ringing noise and everything sounds like it's underwater and all that stuff, but that physical sensation element, that feeling that your body is completely rebelling on you, is something that's very hard to describe. And it's interesting you say you start indirectly, because one of the things that I hit a wall with was, the trauma therapist was, you need a support system. Well, part of my trauma was the fact that I didn't have one. Everybody kind of, well, not kind of, that's distancing language. They either sided with the stalker or didn't want to be around me because of it. So how is somebody supposed to get support? The therapist is saying you need to get support. because this is hard. And people with trauma get stuck in that chicken or the egg problem.
Mhm.
And that was a major thing that made me start doing what I was doing to provide those environmental supports for people who are going through the therapeutic. What's some other stuff you can add to that in terms of that? You can't force having friends. You
Right.
can't will yourself to have a supportive family. You've written about that on your
Mhm.
blog.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So you hit the nail on the head. That is exactly one of the challenges people have. So my students and I and a good colleague of mine, we've started doing some work in online group counseling. And so we actually have a program that is, I say, online for trauma survivors. And one of the things that I really like about that is that everybody in the group obviously has gone through some kind of traumatic event, and it's a little less intimidating than, say, okay, go join a hobby or go join a church group or go join, like, I mean, you're right. Like, people then often feel, people who've been through trauma often feel like, well, I'm not these people, or I don't deserve to be among these quote normal people. I'm so messed up, or, there's a lot of negative self-talk. You talked about shoulds. Oh my gosh, there's
Yeah.
so many
Yeah.
shoulds. I should
Yeah.
really be. I should, and just like negative self-talk. And you can't just tell people stop talking about that way. Like, I mean, it's a process. You just can't tell
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't happen overnight. So we've started doing these groups, and the good thing about them is that it's a little less intimidating. Some of the groups are easier. So we have a sort of assertiveness group. We
Mm.
have a meditation group. And it's not anything different than other meditation groups, except that everybody has a trauma
Right.
history. So it just sort of feels like, okay, I'm with other people, and sort of everybody here is thinking the same, not the same thing, but everybody here, a lot of the people there are thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to fit in? I'm struggling. This is hard. I struggle with other people. I struggle in groups.
Mm-hmm.
So that does sort of just lower the expectations that people have of themselves a little bit, makes it a little bit easier. So that's one helpful thing that I find. I do find that exercise, as long as it's not like a focused weight loss kind of thing, like I
Mm-hmm.
think often trauma survivors, many blame themselves for their body. And I think you don't want to be in a situation where the focus is weight loss. I generally find that to be unhelpful to people, even in the best of circumstances. Um, but I think some kind of non-competitive exercise activities that people can do in groups. That is again, the trick is that it be a supportive environment and non-competitive. That can also be helpful because there can be distraction there. One of my clients who I've been working with for many years is part of a running group, and obviously, you know, um, it's just simply to just get the energy out. She finds that when she starts to feel really triggered, just
Mm-hmm.
running, just that physical feeling in her body, feeling herself sweat, feeling herself breathe, it just makes her feel alive. It makes her feel okay. So yeah, but I mean, that's her. I'm not saying that anybody else needs to do that. I'm just saying, like, that's the idea, is helping people get back into their own feeling like, you own your body, not somebody else.
Yeah. I mean, you dropped a bunch of big words. I'm writing down furiously, like
Sure, sure.
deserve, control, being present. These are all, and I mean, the problem with trauma that a lot of people don't understand, even people with a diagnosis, is that it all gets tangled up. And I mean, everything everywhere all at once was one of the best metaphors for the whole thing, right?
Yeah,
Like the everything bagel.
yeah,
Everything happens at once. If you've got complex trauma, that feeling of control makes you feel like you're not deserving because you don't deserve it. You don't do those things to regain control. And what you said about exercise and it being non-competitive is very interesting to me. And I want to drill down on that because you need wins to rebuild that sense of self, to rebuild those boundaries. A lot of people with trauma never learned how to form boundaries in the first place. That was me. I thought I was good at it. I wasn't. You need little wins. So you need to take risks. So you do need some comparisons to something, but they've got to be positive experiences, especially early on, so that you don't reinforce that I don't deserve good things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's
really well said.
Yeah, that's the core of the challenge. I work with superheroes a lot with my peer counseling clients because I find one, a lot of superheroes have a trauma in their backstory. And so it's a way of talking about it without talking about it, right? You can talk about what the character did as well as the person did, but also it forms trust. It's a common interest. But then even when we sort of figure out what's going on and what a potential good approach is, starting those that risk reward small is really challenging because the early bits have to be so tiny, because it's got to be something. I say on this show, healthy goals are based on things you can control. Mm-hmm. What's controllable in a trauma survivor's life in the early days is very limited in a lot of cases. The family doesn't get it. The friends are like, just snap out of it. Right. How do you tackle that early problem of not making someone feel pathetic? Because I remember somebody said, just go out and have conversations with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was like, this is where I'm at. Really. There's so many things in trauma therapy that make a person feel small, which is counterproductive. So how do you get those early little wins?
Well, okay. I mean, of course, it depends on the person and depends on what wins means to them. I think just go out and have conversations. Actually, honestly, even people who are very successful and comfortable and don't have a trauma history and blah, 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 all that stuff might have difficulty just going out and have conversations randomly with people. Like many people have a much easier time having conversations in role, like if their job is to be a whatever teacher, or their job is to be a, I don't know, you name it, dental hygienist, I don't know, they can have conversations when they're in their job, but it's actually quite challenging in a party situation or in a whatever randomly just talking to strangers. So I think that you have to be quite confident to do that altogether. So that's just bad advice.
Okay. And extroverted. Right. I mean, I'm the same Myers-Briggs personality type as you are. So it's like,
well, I don't know. No, for some people that's easy to do, but it's just for some people it's easy to do, for some people it's hard to do. So you have to know yourself. And I'm just saying, I mean.
All right, that's probably a good place to go to break. Someone who knows what they're doing saying, I got bad advice. I feel validated. We'll be back with Dr. Robert T. Muller, a psychology PhD on It's Not Therapy, talking actually healing from trauma, an alternative view on It's Not Therapy. We'll be back in a bit. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we're still talking what people don't tell you about trauma in therapy. And I have a therapist with me on the interview, Dr. Robert T. Muller. Not that Robert Muller, an even cooler Robert Muller as far as I'm concerned. Now I'm just getting punchy. Before the break, we were talking about those early little wins in trauma therapy that are the beginning of better. And we had to go to break, so I'm going to let Rob pick up on what he was saying about those wins.
But it depends on the person and what small wins means to them. I mean, generally in counseling, we try to get people back to their highest level of functioning prior to the trauma. So, people who let's say someone has a history of I mentioned dental hygienist, someone who was able to work, competent at her job, felt comfortable in the role, was able to talk to people and did reasonably well, and then something happened to her. Let's say she was um, she was date raped, and then she had symptoms of PTSD and found
Mm-hmm.
it difficult to work, found that when she was trying to clean the person's teeth, she was, images were coming back, certain kind of patients, or clients, customers would trigger her, not because of anything bad that they did, but just because of the way they looked or the way they
A
sounded,
smell. Yeah.
a smell, you name it. So somebody like that, obviously, prior to the trauma, let's say prior to a few months earlier, might have been functioning okay in her
Mm-hmm.
job. Um, you would want to help her slowly work back to whatever her highest level of functioning was prior to the traumatic event, and take that slowly and work toward that. Prior to tackling, you'd want to do that before tackling things that she wasn't able to do even before that. So let's just
Right.
say she was fine as a dental hygienist, but frankly didn't feel so comfortable in dating situations. You would not want to focus on dating at all until she started to get some confidence back in whatever she was maybe more comfortable with prior to the trauma. Build, exactly as you said, small wins, get back to some functioning that feels like, hey, oh yeah, I remember what this felt like when I used to be able to do stuff, and feeling a little bit better about herself, and then start thinking about these other areas. And very often I find when you work that way, you realize that there are other traumas that were never talked about. Very often when people have post-traumatic symptoms, yes, it is following a more recent traumatic event. But then when you dig down, you see, oh, yes, actually, there was a little bit of a vulnerability there. The person actually had some traumas when they were younger,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a child of divorce, maybe some emotional abuse from one parent, maybe some bullying in junior high school, dot 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 dot, number of different things, but the person never sought help because they were functioning okay,
Mm-hmm.
but they were maybe a little bit cagey about relationships, and then this date rape happened, and that really sent them for a loop, and started. That's a very common thing for us to
Mm-hmm.
find. And then the question is, what are some of the emotional lessons that the person has learned? Things like, here's a common one: you know what? You can never trust anybody. Or
Mm-hmm.
if you want to get anywhere in life, you have to get there yourself. Or uh, y- you know, people, I don't deserve to be loved.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't deserve the good things in life. Other people do more than
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
These are all messages that go into our unconscious, really. And very often they're lifelong messages that then get triggered when traumatic events happen,
Mm-hmm.
and then keep popping up. And so you want to understand, as time goes on with people in counseling anyway, what are some of these lifelong messages that they've learned that
Mm-hmm.
have done them a disservice. And then
Yeah, those negative core
yeah,
beliefs can bite.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yes. So the CBT therapists refer to them as core
Yeah.
beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But absolutely, yeah, for sure, they really do.
There's a paradox. Yeah, you want to get some things back, right? Yes, you do. The functionality. But one of the things I had to learn is trying to go back. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be the same person that happened. That's why it's post-traumatic growth, not post-traumatic reset. Trying to get things to go back to the way they were can, because of those that negative, I call it the negative narrative. You can't control what happened to you. You can change the story of what happened to you, right? Bruce Banner can be a guy with the ID who spends a lot of time alone and loses all his friends, or he can be a superhero called the Incredible Hulk. The details don't change. That paradox of getting some things back, but also accepting that certain things aren't coming back. And that's a good thing. Instead of just getting it all back, you can have better. It's
Yeah,
more art than science, and it's
yeah.
so easy to mess up.
Yeah, let me comment on that.
Yeah.
I think that that's a very important point. When I said highest level of functioning, I was speaking more to the idea of what to start with
Right.
in a counseling kind of situation,
Yeah.
in terms of functionality. But I think but what you're speaking to is extremely important regarding the issue of identity and what people might expect post trauma. What can you expect? And I use the metaphor of like, and I'm really glad you talked about I think you used the story,
Yeah, yeah.
that here you have a story and your life was a certain way, and then this thing happened, and this trauma that happened is a chapter in your life. And it's a chapter that is going to, of course, as in any good book, a chapter will affect all the other chapters. And otherwise, it shouldn't be in the book, right? I mean, if it's a good book, the chapters accumulate, things happen, and we build on them. Well, same thing here. This chapter happened in your life, and it'll affect all the other chapters. But it's not the final chapter.
Mm-hmm.
It's a chapter. And then what you do afterwards depends on how you author your story.
Yeah.
What kind of story are you going to tell? And so, what do you do with that? That's a big question. And so the trauma, I also talk about this other metaphor of living alongside your trauma.
Yeah.
The trauma doesn't all of a sudden become the defining piece of your identity. You live with your trauma. It's there. It doesn't disappear or go
Mm-hmm.
away. It would be just bullshitting yourself to say, "Oh yeah, I'll just get over it." You don't get over some of these things.
No.
But what happens is you learn how to cope, you
Yeah.
learn and you build new life experiences. And
Yeah.
as you build new life experiences and learn from the things from the past and grow from them, then you build a new life for yourself. And so what your identity can look like can actually be different than you ever imagined. And the story looks different than maybe you imagined before the trauma. But can you have a good life? Yes, you can.
Yeah.
It's not closed off to you.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
that's
that identity piece, identity is one of the most misunderstood things in our modern world. And I want to close on that. We think of identity as building blocks because of how it's in the news, identity groups, identifiers, all this stuff, right? Gender identity, racial identity. Identity ain't that. It's this idea of who you are, what you're made up of, where the world ends and you begin. And identity is that thing that trauma can take from us, or like you said, it can be an important part of us depending on our relationship with it.
right,
So
right.
if you
That's
can't,
beautifully said. A part of
right,
us, depending on our relationship with it, how we make sense of and integrate and 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 how the choices we make for how we now want to, like I said, author our lives at this point.
right,
But we
right.
have to have a relation. There has to be a relationship to the trauma of some sort. And what is that relationship? That's something that in counseling I work with people to help them explore. But I think, but that's good. Yeah, it's really well said. Yeah, a
Yeah.
relationship with the
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you get into I mean, I'm a big fan of the core of DBT therapy, but the terminology sucks, right? And you get therapists who use the tools, use the tools. Well, a person is not a lathe, right?
Mhm.
A person is not a power drill. We need more than tools. We need metaphor, we need myth, and we need narrative, we need authoring, right? And that idea that we can control our meta emotions, our meta narrative, our story about our story
Mhm.
is something I found really helpful. But again, if you don't have a solid sense of identity, that's very hard. How do you tell a story if you haven't fleshed out your main character? I find people who are stuck in trauma therapy have breakthroughs after they talk about, say, being an author or being an artist, like you talked about, those other elements, those talents they have, those skills they have that can create a structure for their healing that I find get neglected in the very regimented, you do mindfulness, you do distress tolerance, you do, blah, blah, blah. You seem to have a very, very personal approach
Yeah, yeah,
to what you do.
100%.
Yeah.
I think those techniques and coping skills are are come out of a tradition, a more psychiatric medical model tradition. Not that I disagree with that. I think there's a piece of that that's true. There's some very real truth to that. After when people have trauma, they really do have anxiety and depression,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
like a lot of psychiatric symptoms are, come with trauma. So and it's painful for people, and they're suffering,
mm-hmm,
and they need a little bit of help with how to deal with that suffering. And
mm-hmm.
sort of meds can be part of that, actually.
Yeah,
I'm not against people using the medications that can be helpful to them. So I'm all for that. Anything that can help you feel better. But over beyond that, I
mm-hmm.
think we can do so much work with helping people understand who they are as a person. What does the traumatic event mean to them, or the events mean to them? um I often say to people, often talk about, well, the world is so screwed up, and I will say, well,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, like, I don't try to disabuse them of that notion. The question is, where can we help you find a place in this?
Right,
Given that this world is fucked up, where can we help you find a place in it? A place that gives you a sense of meaning, that gives you a sense of direction,
right.
that can be emotionally okay for you, maybe even emotionally growthful for you. That's the more the humanistic aspect of trauma therapy that it's really important, to
Yeah,
include.
yeah. That whole the world thing, the galaxy brain, as I call it, is a big thing right now. And to me, that's a narrative, right? Because we don't engage with the world all at once. We don't. It's not possible. We only engage with our little corner of it. And
Yeah.
sure, macro events can affect us. Usually they don't, or they don't all at once. Somebody can lose their job in a bull market. Somebody can get the opportunity of their life in desperate economic times. And that awareness, the sheer amount of information that people have to process on a daily basis is, I think, a big part of it. Our awareness of the world is just so much bigger. And I found, to go back to that thing you said about depression, anxiety, these big terms, these medicalized terms,
Yeah.
right? It's the same stuff the ancient Greeks, the Norse Vikings were talking about with Ares and Zeus and Odin and Thor. We just have these terms now: depression,
Sure.
anxiety. When we actually think about it, what do these words mean? Anxiety is a list of 20 symptoms. Depression is a list of 40 symptoms.
Yeah, I agree with you, and so I think one of the topics I have in my book actually is the topic of suffering. I use the
Yeah,
word suffering, and I think, because I also agree with you. I don't They're useful terms to the extent that language is useful. Like,
right.
we come up with medical terms. Why? Because they mean something. It's a shortcut. If you say depression, I can imagine a whole bunch of different things. But the thing that happens when people have these traumatic events so often is they begin to experience human suffering. And yes, internal emotional states that we would call depression or anxiety,
Mm-hmm,
but it's much bigger than that. Very often it's questions like, okay, well, what am I doing here? And why did I even bother working so hard if I was gonna blah blah blah, if this was gonna
mm-hmm,
happen to me? And
mm-hmm,
like, they're questions about your purpose in life, and like, and then things that people say to themselves, like, I'm useless. And so the psychiatric language doesn't even begin
mm-mm,
to tackle that stuff. That's much more existential
mm-hmm,
and emotional and internal. So, I mean, I like the word suffering because different people have different ways of suffering. And one of the things about trauma is that we do know that it causes suffering,
mm-hmm,
and people want to get back to a way in their lives. But like you said, it's not exactly getting back to the way you were before the trauma. It's a way of being able to live your life and be able to feel like you can be okay in this
mm-hmm,
world, and
mm-hmm.
that might look different than you ever imagined.
And it's weird. We live in this, I go back to superheroes, a superhero boom. But
Mm.
those characters were created in the 40s through the 60s. The first golden age of comics was 39 with Superman going forward. The second, the Stan Lee era, the Silver Age. Those are very tumultuous times in the world. And if you look at Batman, his parents were murdered when he was 6, right? It's a crime wave. Superman has, you write a ton about the immigrant experience on your blog, right? And then Spider-Man, bit by a radioactive spider, Daredevil, an accident, right? Like he's blind, the dude. It's always some traumatic event. And there are reasons for this. The writers were talking about themselves. Suffering brings wisdom. That was something I learned the hard way. Why do you think people treat suffering as a thing that breaks us instead of suffering as a thing that makes us wise?
That's a bit more of a philosophy question, but I don't have an answer to that. But I will just simply say that I agree with you. That seems to be, after. I mean, I think the one thing I can comment on that perhaps is that to some extent we live in a bit of an illusion, right? I mean, there was a psychology professor at U of T who talked about reality is just a story our brain tells us, right? And so, I mean, we live in our own realities based on our own experiences, and very often they're filled with illusions and assumptions, and we live in this idea that the world is generally a safe place if we've never had anything bad happen to us.
Right.
We live in a world where we sort of have an illusion that things are going to be okay, that we make assumptions about ourselves and our loved ones being alive, for aging obviously changes that, but we make all these assumptions. We just simply don't assume that when we go on that date or when we go on that subway ride that some terrible thing's going to happen, or when we go on that. On the other hand, what kind of life do we create for ourselves if we assume that there's danger at every turn?
Right.
So I think we, to some extent, need to live in this way, and that when we do have a traumatic event happen, often it's sort of there's a shocking element to it. It's like, oh wait, I wasn't expecting that. And so it's hugely disappointing. It's hugely frightening. It creates this. It rocks our sense of the world as a safe place, and then that suffering becomes this sort of thing, this burden. And initially people just like, oh, I want to turn back the clock, but they can't turn back the clock. They have to sort of assimilate the losses, and if you've had some terrible car accident and you no longer have use of something, or you're in pain or whatever, you have part of the acceptance is the idea that there's going to be there's this change in me and I've lost something, and for me to be able to live my life moving forward, integrating that loss and then finding a way forward, that's hard. That's painful. And I think, that's part of it. But I think out of that process, then comes a wisdom, a knowledge that, okay, I can do this, and I can, so not just survive, but I can actually live a productive, happy life. And that's not obviously initially so clear to people.
Right.
I mean, that's my understanding of it anyway, but I know we probably need to end soon.
All right. Hint. Dr. Robert T. Muller, amazing, author of Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up. Rob, you mentioned the group therapy stuff you do. How do people get in touch with you if they want to access some of these programs?
So it's called Trauma Practice. So if you just Google, I think www.traumapractice.org, I think, get in touch with them for online groups that are free.
Rob, thanks so much for your time.
Of course.
Dr. Robert T. Muller, PhD, author of Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, traumapractice.org. Rob is so soft-spoken. When we come back, a few more minutes on what I wish I'd known when I was in trauma therapy, because I am not a therapist, and this is It's Not Therapy. Back soon. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. And we're still talking for just a few more minutes about what I wish I'd been told back in trauma therapy. Now, we touched on it in the interview with Rob, and it was that some things ain't coming back. And what happened was a terrible thing. But the things that are not going to come back eventually lead to new good things. And it is a loss. You do have to grieve the loss of the old normal for better. And that's what I say instead of new normal. It's better. Through the process of going through the darkest moments of your life, it is possible to learn new, I go back to it all the time, superpowers, because that's how I phrase things. Batman's not just somebody whose parents killed when he was 6. Batman has skills. He has an individual personality. He likes dressing up like a giant bat. That's distinct, right? And so are you. Everybody's story is different. And just keep in mind that the traumatic event is the beginning of the superhero story. It's sometimes the middle of the superhero story. It's not the end. And it's not the end for you. And if you're looking to do better, get involved in a program, traumapractice.org is Rob's site. If you want to check out my workshop on how to stop beating yourself up, it's not free. And there's a reason for that. You're worth the $10. $10 is less than 2 Starbucks coffees these days. And to me, that little bit of saying I'm worth it is part of the practice. At least it was for me. That step to invest in yourself, invest in others, invest in life again. It's so crucial. And we're making the baby steps as tiny as we possibly can, because we talked in the interview. We know we have to. You don't have to use your voice. You don't have to show your face. It's totally online. So you can just use chat and a pseudonym if you want. NotTherapyShow.com. That's NotTherapyShow.com. If you just want to join our mailing list, if you just want to keep tabs on what the show and our events are doing, NotTherapyShow.com. It's there too. And you can leave a comment. You can ask a question. NotTherapyShow.com. I keep saying NotTherapyShow.com so you'll remember it. But also remember, signing off, you know what I'm going to say. Your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you, including the crazy world. See you next week. Take care of yourself till then.